Hello, everyone. In this final recording for the second module, we shall try to focus very much on the notion of knowledge and positionality and the notion of discourse and power, which are believed to very much influence how policy practice is made under the interpretive approach. Many scholars, including Michel Foucault, argue that knowledge is acquired through interpretation, which is in itself a subjective process. So Michel Foucault, for example, argues that knowledge and power are deeply connected and that these two cannot be separated. So this in itself means that the way in which we understand and problematize issues can vary considerably in relation to which positions we occupy in the society. And even the position we occupy itself can end up influencing the knowledge we have, and that in itself can influence what we are likely to perceive to be a problem or not a problem, and potentially what we perceive to be the solution to those problems and what is not the solution. So this problematizes the way in which we really make policies, and also points on the significant role of language in how we define the problems and how we try to address them. So on the illustration here, you can see a clear image, and at times you might wonder, is it a wall? Is it just a tree? Is it a snake? Is it a spear? Is it a rope? So clearly you see, again, this is what we are trying to do in the interpretive model, trying to understand the same issue and the same policy options through multiple speculations and multiple ways of looking at things. So clearly in this context, language becomes an important element of whatever we do. And that in itself, again, is influenced by our positionality, which just entails our experiences and our background. And this, of course, influences the way we are likely to interpret and even the language we use to describe things, including social problems. So language is clearly a form of power in itself because it decides whose voices are heard and which experiences are valued or are even regarded as problematic. So, for example, labeling people as welfare recipients versus labeling them as people experiencing hardship. So those are two kinds of framings, and these two framings really might differently shape what people are likely to get from the support services. Also important here consideration is to consider how powerful institutions such as the government or even the media might play a key role in producing these dominant discourses or even shaping what we are likely to see as a problem and what has to be put in place to address that problem. So Michel Foucault, one of the early scholars theorizing the notion of language, discourse, knowledge, and power. So he argued that discourses are not simply ways of speaking, they are practices in themselves that systematically form the objects of which they speak. So in this context, power and knowledge are, according to Foucault, not separate entities, they directly imply one another. And of course, the control over discourse becomes in itself a significant form of power. So policy language should not be understood as transparent or even as reflecting an objective reality. And I think this is the idea which the interpretive model is really trying to challenge. So instead, discourse, knowledge, discourse, just as language and knowledge, is a form of social action that directs our attention to certain problems while neglecting others. This is exactly what Marston is arguing. So the notion of power, language, and knowledge are very important notions because power in policy is exercised through dominant knowledge and claims. And we can see clearly how these three concepts, knowledge, power, and discourses, are interlinked, cannot be separated, and how both all three concepts come together in influencing not only our understanding of social problems, but even the solutions we end up adopting to address those problems. So here in Australia, for example, policy debates often involve competing discourses. And this is not only really in Australia, it's everywhere around the world. One dominant discourse frames welfare recipients as needing to be activated to work. Another might, of course, portray systemic inequalities and structural barriers, emphasizing social justice. So again, all these are very important considerations speaking to how and why people are likely to frame, policy problems in a certain way, depending on what they believe in and depending on the positions they really occupy in the society. So understanding policy through the lenses of language, power, and discourse is very important because power does not always, I think power is something really which very much shapes the way we understand problem. But again, power itself does not always involve an act of coercion by one group over another. And I think Foucault very much argues that power is not something which is given, and it doesn't always involve only coercion. Power is all about also the internalization of these power relations. And there is this kind of mutually reinforcing relationship between the dominant groups and the dominated groups in all sorts of power relations, which tends to suggest that it's not only all about the people who are in power, but even the people who are perceived as powerless. All of them may tend to adopt a certain way of looking at things. All of them might tend to adopt different languages, and those languages can problematize what we perceive to be social problems in one way or another. So power is exercised through a technology of disciplinary norms. And I think this is where exactly internalization of power relations becomes problematic, because by the time people who are in the marginalized circle gets to internalize that, it stops being just the problem of the people who are in power, but in a sense, these people who are marginalized get to kind of reinforce the power of those who are dominant in the society, and it always works that way. And this is Michel Foucault's core argument, and we see this very much when it comes to whose narratives, whose discourse is most heard when it comes to making policies, and why some policy problems are being shaped or problematized in one way or another. So according to Michel Foucault, then discourse doesn't just reflect reality, it is constructed. And what we end up again getting as problems or social policy problems and solutions, again, that's something which is in itself socially constructed. So you might wonder, why is it important to know all these theoretical frameworks? These are really very important, not only knowledge and power, but even discourse, which is a key element of the interpretive model. They're very important because then they get to influence the way we define and explain issues. The way we define and explain social problems very much rely on not only the power we have or the positions we occupy in the society, but even the knowledge we have and the language we have acquired in doing that. So this is also very important because it constitutes how various groups or individuals interact in the way they participate in policy making, including the government, the markets, and other actors, and how they interact. So these interactions, which involve at times negotiations and different sorts of political processes, are very important when it comes to policy making. So again, the way we understand policy, the way we understand discourse as power and knowledge is very important because that portrays how and in what context dominant discourses, may be problematic, and even the behaviors and conduct which are associated with those in policy making and policy practice broadly. So this then really influences what policies are pursued, what we end up adopting as policies, and what we end up rejecting on the policy agenda, and whose narrative, whose story is being told when discussing different policy issues. So discourses really construct social realities, govern what is thinkable, and that the discourse also shapes how we act to address those problems. And this is a core argument again in Michel Foucault's readings. So at this point, I would now like to invite you to go back to your learning activities, to watch this very short video about how certain issues are being portrayed in the Australian context, and try to reflect on how language is being used in that context, and maybe even try to reflect who's using that language, who are we getting that language from, and how does maybe their positionality influence the way that problem is being framed, but also how is it categorizing people, what is being said. So what meaning is it trying to impose in this situation? And what does this tell us about the dominant view of how things should be done in the Australian society? After doing that, you would also want to look at this podcast where Taylor discussed about the politics, discourse, and practice associated with the programs in Australia. So you might want to consider that, and we shall meet in the next module.